Hi, everyone. My name is Sabrina Fernandes. I'm a sociologist from Brazil, and it is my pleasure to be here today with Joe Sacco. And we're here invited by Editora Veneta to talk about his comic book, his masterpiece here called Palestine. But he's also done very other incredible work as well, reporting from the Bosnian War, some stuff around colonial settings in North America as well, work that he has done actually complementing things from here with footnotes from Gaza. So going back in terms of historical journalism. And today we have the opportunity to talk to Joe a little bit more about his work, things that have changed from the time when he wrote this. When this came out originally, I believe it was 1993, right? So nine
Yeah, I started.
issues. Yeah,
That's
nine
right.
issues from 1993. So it's been a while. We're talking about a lot of changes in these past decades here. So it's great to have you here, Joe. Thank you for offering the time.
Well, thank you, Sabrina. I'm looking forward to this.
So I'd like to open the conversation with this issue around the time passing, around things that have changed. We were just speaking, like I was in Palestine just recently, back in May. You obviously went back and forth many times when you're doing your research. And something that I wanted to ask you about is that what do you think has changed from when you came out with this piece, from way back in the day when you were talking about Palestine, doing investigative journalism paired with comic book writing. So obviously breaking through the bubble, reaching other people that normally were just getting information from the news. Do you think that things have really changed in the past 30 years or so in the sense of how people are getting information about what goes on in Palestine? So not only West Bank and Gaza, but the Middle East region in general?
Yeah, I think a lot of things have changed as far as how people get their information. Obviously, social media has had a big impact. A lot of news or a lot of things that are going on are not filtered by the mainstream media. So sometimes what we're getting is really raw images and raw footage from places, for example, today in Gaza. Now, I mean, that raw footage has to be judged in a certain sense. You have to make sure it's accurate and that whole thing. But that's a big change as far as how people are getting their information. Then there are those sorts of news services like Al Jazeera that have started up that are now doing some really good reporting, on the ground reporting from some very brave Palestinian journalists. So not everything is now being filtered through the mainstream, and often the mainstream sort of aligns itself with authority and the powers that be. But I'd say the biggest change probably in 30 years from when I was there is just the escalation in violence. I mean, it's funny looking at the book I did, Palestine, which is about the first Intifada. It almost seems like a naive time in a certain sense. I mean, you were talking about hundreds of people who were injured and killed over some years. And you were talking about people in prison, olive trees being cut down, every now and then home demolitions. All that escalated quite a bit. So when I was there in the early 2000s, mostly in Gaza, you know, violence on both sides that escalated. The Palestinians were using suicide bombings. They were, throwing stones is something they've done and they still do, but there was some real violence from that end, but also the Israelis were beginning to use tanks and jets. And now look at it. I mean, now, another 20 years on, and we're talking about probably the heaviest aerial bombardment in a concentrated place that probably historically, as far as conventional bombing goes. That's an amazing amount of violence. So the escalation has greatly increased. But now it seems like we're at this point where things seem really existential, I'd say for both Israelis and Palestinians. It seems to be a matter of, in their minds, sheer existence.
There's something really, you just mentioned the role of Palestinian journalists, and we know that many of them have been killed during these aerial strikes. in the past days. We also know of Palestinian journalists being targeted directly, so like targeted with snipers and targeted for imprisonment. So there's a level of censorship that goes on that's not just regular censorship, not just not getting the word out, even though there are threats right now from Israel saying that they're going to shut down the operations, like Al Jazeera and some other reporting agencies, trying to basically promote like a blackout of information getting to the outside. But at the same time, a lot of lobbying, for example, trying to do paid promotion with influencers so they can talk about Israel, so they can offer other opinions. So it does really seem that the game has changed in the sense of the narratives here. And I remember a while back you mentioned that before Lebanon and attacks on the refugee camps in Lebanon, most of what you heard was really this idea of the Palestinians as terrorists. And then it was important to get there to see things with your own eyes, to be able to tell a different kind of story. And there's a moment here, and I'm going to show the book again because it's like this beautiful hardcover here, special edition. And even it has like a really interesting introduction by you, some showing photos from back in the day and how you translated the images into the panoramas, how we actually built the story. So it's really delightful to see that. But there's a moment right in the beginning of the story when people are turning to you and they're saying, are you going to write something about us? Like I showed you, you saw it. Can you tell people about us? So that leads me into a reflection about the role of the outsiders. We understand that back in the day, it was very, very, very much important because mainstream media was only basically showing part of the story. So the outsiders coming in, they gave this opportunity to share the story. But now Palestinians get to talk more, which is really important. Is there still a role for outsiders? What can we add as outsiders going in terms of sharing the story, but doing that with responsibility and not replicating other colonial patterns?
That's a big question and an interesting one. Sometimes you're in a situation as an outsider where you can reflect in different ways. First of all, my audience is generally the outside audience. So I can come in with some of, let's say, my Western prejudices that a reader is going to appreciate, but then they're going to see how someone, even with Western prejudices, can sort of assimilate, get to know people, accept the hospitality. I think that was a big part of what I learned when I was there, was just the sheer amount of hospitality I received. Those sorts of things I think are really good to show to outsiders. And you can, when you're an outsider, people react in a certain way to you. You realize they see you as a projection of the outside world. So when they're questioning me, sometimes interrogating me, like, what good is it going to do for you to come here? People have been writing about us. What good does it do? Those are questions that are important for me to hear, but they're also important for the audience, or my audience, to hear. They begin to see things, they begin to see how, let's say with the Palestinians, how they feel their lives are refracted through Western eyes all the time. And I think that's an important point, because then it helps the reader understand that that the voices of those sorts of people are often refracted. But I'm sort of a sympathetic refraction. I'm not one that's interrogating them, saying things like, why do you do this? What do you condemn this? That sort of interrogation for someone who's also under living trauma. That's something that I've tried to navigate. And the truth is, I question that sort of thing in myself also, especially nowadays, because we often think of the outside voice as being problematic. But I've also got a journalistic background, so I sort of have this pretense or this feeling that no, I can go in and I can keep my eyes open. I might have prejudices and sympathies and all that, but I'm willing to sort of see things from my own point of view, which isn't really an objective point of view. It's more like I have sympathy and empathy for the Palestinians. I think they've been historically wronged, but I try to look at things quite honestly. You know, if people say things that might not make them look good, it's still part of the equation. And I think it's what really shows things in their depth. I'm not really an activist in that way where I go in and I want to show the best possible face on the Palestinians. I want to show a real face, you know, just to the best of my abilities.
That's very interesting. And you have drawn this distinction between like an activist type of work and the journalist type of work in terms of the responsibilities, how you tell the story. And this connects to this effort around humanizing Palestinians. So we're not putting them into this little box that you have to be a perfect victim, because only a perfect victim is worthy of protection, and protection not only by the occupying power, Israel, that has shown time and again that is not willing to protect. It's quite the contrary, but also protection under humanitarian law, protection by other institutions, and even worthy of empathy and solidarity. But it's interesting that I see that even from the activist side of things, that has been something that that's promoted nowadays, that if we show the flaws, if we show the contradictions, we're actually more likely to reach people and politicize over the issue. So I'd say that perhaps the activist side on Palestine is willing to learn more and more about how it's useful to show the flaws and the contradictions of the process, because that helps with the context. Wouldn't say so? Like, so do you think like the line sometimes between the journalist side and the activist side, they get even more blurred in a sense, because it's about responsibility and not just an ideological stance?
Well, that's an interesting point. I mean, from my own point of view, you know, I don't think of myself as an activist. People often say that I'm an activist, but I definitely see a blurring, because I think it's clear. You know, I don't go in with the objective style, let's say the American style of journalism, where I'm just going to go and see, and I'm going to quote this spokesperson on this side and this spokesperson on that side, and then it's up to the reader. I have sympathies. I have empathy. I don't really believe you can be objective about certain things. What you can be is honest. And if activists are also thinking those terms, I think that's all for the best. I definitely think that's all for the best. I mean, and what you said earlier was interesting, like the concept of humanizing, which is also sort of a problematic term on some level. But when I first started to think about the Palestinian issue, my original idea was to sit at home and draw human rights reports about what Palestinians had experienced. And these sorts of reports were basically things that you could use in a courtroom. They were very dry. And at some point I realized, you know, if I do this, this will just make Palestinians sound as victims with a capital V. But I'm also interested in Palestinians with some agency. I mean, they respond to the occupation. They resist in their own ways, in many different ways. And there are other things going on in their lives besides the occupation. They still want to go to school. They still want to raise their children. All the things that we think of as really prosaic, that's part of their lives too. They're trying to live that under really extreme conditions. And I think to show that, that's something sort of as an outsider, you can sort of pick up on and notice. You know, sometimes it does help to have a perspective that where, you know, where people there, everything is so normal. The sort of violence for them is sort of, and sort of humiliations are so normal, it's not even worth talking about amongst themselves, a lot of it. But when I come in, I'm sort of startled by it. So what is ordinary to them is really extraordinary and wrong. So as an outsider, you can get that perspective too. And I think both activists and journalists obviously see that. And so the more we can, you know, I feel I'm not an activist, but have a lot of sympathy towards activism. But that's great to hear what you're saying, that activists are also thinking in those terms.
Yes, I think I want to pick up on a couple of points when you're saying that in terms of this normalization, there's not just the institutional normalization of settler colonialism, but also the fact that it's part of your everyday life, that if you're only putting this into the terms of survival or the terms of resistance, let's say with a capital R, to use that standpoint as well, then you're missing out on the fact that you have regular heartbreak in Palestine. You have neighbors fighting with each other. You have gossip. You have people who like each other who don't like each other. You have people discussing fashion topics and where did you buy this thing? I like that too. So those matters of the everyday life, they're really important to approach people from the outside. And sometimes when they look into I've been seeing, for example, people making comments around the photos from like before and after bombings in Gaza, and understanding that even though Gaza is under siege for so long, considering like this last siege from 2007, it's not a bunch of people living in tents. There are buildings, there are like historical sites. Like it was a very lively community that got built from before that, and that's being destroyed piece by piece. And in that sense, don't you think that the method itself of drawing images to show the people around it and putting yourself, so like for those who are watching us and they're going to read Palestine now, you can identify Joe throughout the book, and showing yourself like you're sitting in the living room, so you're not like a regular CNN journalist just putting a microphone and asking for sound bites. So to take it from like Rafik Ziada's poem on like asking to memorize sound bites and UN resolutions. People are not going to do that when you're sitting in their living room and they're offering you tea like they always do. So like these, in a sense, would you say that the hospitality itself is a way of breaking with the normalization? They're taking that opportunity to be like, okay, we're going through everything and occupation has taken over our lives. And sometimes it's falling to the background, but now there's this outsider here. And then we get to reflect on it too. Is it a collective process, perhaps?
Is it a what process? Sorry?
A collective process of like reflecting back and again when there's this person coming in.
Well, I think the power of doing drawings is that there's a lot of material in the background, things that you can show. I mean, you can have people in the foreground, for example, talking about the political situation, whatever it is, but in the background, you see them playing with their children, you see the tea coming in. All that stuff creates, it sort of creates a more holistic idea of how people's lives are. I mean, it's something that you were saying earlier. It's people, things are going on. People fight with their neighbors. I mean, people are falling in love. And meanwhile, all these other things are going on. And if you can pick up on those sorts of things, that's, I think it's a good approach, because obviously what matters, it matters that people are being bombed. It matters that people are being taken to prison. But it also matters that these things are going on, sort of overlaying how people are trying to also live a very normal life, as we would here if we were under the same circumstances. So it is important for me. I mean, in a very crude and a dark sense, I want people to meet the people I met. I want them to walk through those doors, sit down with them on mats on the floor, because they often didn't have furniture, and let them, because really what they're going to do is bring out the best they have. They're going to, you know what I mean? It's like they're going to bring out, if they're going to send someone to go get something to cook for me. So to show all that, I think it's really, it's part of the process of sort of bringing those people to life. And then I think, in my own dark way, now if you want to bomb these people, go ahead, but first let's meet them first.
This is a really important point that you're bringing up here, because we're always trying to call attention to the fact that in media, Israelis get killed and Palestinians just die. So you have like a number of that. So, so many thousands of children dead, as if it just happened by any chance, or like we're not really naming the perpetrator of the crimes, of the war crimes in media. So people are using the social media platforms to try to bring more attention to this fact. But even when we change the language, the sheer amount of people living under occupation and being arrested, there's a moment in the book where they're just pointing out random man on the street. It's like, okay, so his son is in prison, 2 children in prison. Oh, that one here lost his father. It's just everywhere. So when the number takes over, that's another way of taking away people's idea of solidarity, because you can connect, you can see them. And obviously when you're doing perhaps a documentary or you're taking photos, people are very aware that their image is being taken here. So they might try to behave in a separate way. When you're drawing, do you get the opportunity to try to bring that natural sense of being there because there was not a camera? Like, do you get an advantage by drawing?
I think so. I mean, I think documentary filmmakers, photographers all do really great work, but I have seen people respond differently when there are cameras around. There's sort of a, I mean, not in all cases, obviously, but sometimes it can be sort of an acting. Well, there's a camera, I suppose I'm supposed to be yelling or whatever it is. And the nice thing about drawing, I guess even with a writer, a writer or a reporter, is that you can sort of quietly sit in the corner. And I'm a relatively unassuming person. I mean, I'm not like hovering over people, and I'm learning from them. They don't really need to learn anything from me, you know? So I'm very aware of that. So I think there's an approach with drawing. It's kind of a slow approach. It's sort of a gentle approach. I don't have to go in and for 2 hours do all these interviews and, you know, as you said, stick a microphone in someone's face and get a quote. I can sit with people for some time. I can even get to know people before I ask them a question that sort of leading into something. But as you know, and as you mentioned, the truth is these stories are just, you can pluck them out of the air. Everywhere you turn, there is loss and humiliation and heartache about what's happening. And at this point, it's a matter of sheer survival.
If everywhere you turn, there's a story, there's something that you think is worthwhile telling, something that perhaps touched you, that you connected with, how do you choose? How do you choose what you put within 9 issues that then becomes this big volume here? You did over 100 interviews. It was participant observation. So, and it's really nice because we see you as part of the story and outside of the story at the same time. So the way you draw yourself, the way, even with the montages in the panorama. So you're a little bit outside reflecting on things, then you're just sitting there listening. So this tension around like negotiating your role there, that's very visible. But the part of choosing, because in this edition here, we get to see your diaries as well, like some photos of the diaries, and you had to write down and then reflect on what you put in the story, what you don't put in the story. And do you have criteria for that, or that's something that's ongoing, that's changing all the time?
It depends on the story. And I mean, the truth is that when I was doing the Palestine story, I was sort of formulating what I was doing as I was doing it. It was easier in my later books when I was much more focused and I knew kind of what I was doing. But maybe the charm of the Palestine book is it's kind of clear I was bumbling around. And there was something good about that, I think, because I was interested in the random nature of what I was finding out. You know, I would go to a town, get out of a taxi, and I knew for certain that someone would come up to me and just say, "What are you doing here?" You know, I'm a foreigner. See, there's another advantage of being an outsider. What are you doing here? And I'd say, I just want to see how you live here. And they would decide what I was going to see. Oh, you want to see some injuries? Come with me. Oh, I'll bring you to someone whose house just got demolished. That sort of randomness was how I approached my work. And also, there's a bit of a scattered nature to it, in that sometimes one story comes up and then something similar is repeated many pages later. Part of that was purposeful in a way. I wanted to show how often the same story comes up, how often people were imprisoned, for example. People have gone through a lot of the same things. So in that particular case, there was a randomness about it. But as far as what I chose, obviously it's sometimes I chose things because they would help repeat that story, so you knew this was a common story. Other times I chose things because they were very particular. For example, there's a whole chapter about someone being interrogated for a long time. I spoke to other people who were interrogated, and some of the stories were sort of more extreme. But I thought I would choose one that seemed more typical of what I was hearing. You see, so it's like I don't always want to choose the most extreme. I want to choose somehow the most ordinary, which is extreme enough.
Yeah, it's sort of a way of skipping the tendency of just trying to shock people. This is the worst case scenario here. And when you kind of go back to what would be the average scenario, is already a really bad scenario. And the fact that it's average should be shocking enough. So
right.
It seems to me like very, very good criteria for approaching that. Going back to the situation around Gaza specifically. So when you were there, and this is something that we try to emphasize when we're doing political education work on Palestine, is that the settler colonialism is a shifting thing. So when you are in Hebron is not like that anymore. When you portrayed it here, it's changing. Like the Hebron's being picked apart in many different ways, especially the more the division between the Oslo process advanced. And Gaza changed a lot because of the siege since 2007. But when you were reporting from Bosnia back then, you also experienced a siege from a different perspective, right? So the siege was kind of ending, people are not really getting out, but you were going in. Do you like, can you reflect a little bit of that on like this type of different scenarios? So a place where you could hop on a taxi from Gaza and go to Jerusalem back then, was something people can't do now. But also when you were reporting from Bosnia, you were relying on convoys. So if you didn't have access to the convoy, like where am I going? Like I'm missing my ride, right? So there's these dynamics around mobility and being able to tell the story as well that show that conflict areas, they're everywhere, but they do take on very different dynamics, no?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, and freedom of movement is probably sort of the foundation of freedom in general. The idea that I can leave my house and go to the store is something I take for granted. But if I was stopped from doing that, you would notice it, right? And there's definitely I felt that in Bosnia, but I had freedom of movement, or I had some freedom of movement based on my press card, whereas the people I was meeting, they couldn't move at all. I mean, they were still trapped. And even when supposedly the so-called Blue Road was open to them and they could leave, they were afraid to leave. Initially, they were afraid to leave because what does that mean? I mean, I'm going to go through enemy territory and what could happen? You know, so even freedom of movement is also a state of mind on some level. And it's interesting how easy it was when I first went to Palestine. I flew in through Cairo, and then I took a bus, and the bus went from Cairo to Jerusalem. Now you couldn't even imagine such a thing now. And even the last time I went to Gaza, it wasn't fully closed. I mean, it was difficult for people to get out, and you needed permits to work in Israel and all that sort of thing. And those were very they were sort of revered items. You had a permit to get out. But I got into Gaza the last time I went on a tourist visa. I tried to get press credentials, and the Israeli authorities weren't going to give them to me. And they basically said, okay, well, just go to the crossing. And if the soldiers let you in, they let you in. If they don't, they don't. That's gone now too. You can imagine what it's going to be like now. You know, there was very, very limited movement out of Gaza, usually had to be coordinated with the Israeli authorities. A lot of people who needed medical treatment that they couldn't get in Gaza couldn't leave and have died. I mean, just as before the siege. And of course, there are many people who were accepted in colleges, can't get out. They can't, foreign colleges, they cannot get out. It's just this, it's very stifling and limited. And I think the way it seems to be playing out, I'm not sure if it'll end this way, but the way it's playing out it's meant to be even more limited.
Yeah, the way that it's playing out right now, it does seem that every time we're looking at the news and there's a new statement coming from Israeli officials, especially when they say, well, we told you to get out, right? So like just move from north of Gaza to the south, and then we're going to carpet bomb this area, but we told you to get out. So in a sense, it's like, if there's a genocide happening, it's because you didn't let us go through with ethnic cleansing. So it is either expulsion or direct death, and it's just very, very cruel. And in a sense, it does show that it seems like we're moving to a new stage after 75 years. Every now and then in this story, something happens that changes the dynamics. So it can be the Intifadas, it can be Oslo Accords, Six-Day War, 1967. There are very different moments in this timeline here, and does seem that we're running into one of those, and that calls into question really something that we're still trying to figure out what to do, which is the fact that people are feeling hopeless, even as they're trying to denounce what's happening. There's this sense that no matter how much we explain the conflict in Palestine, or we try to convince people, it seems like this is an unmovable state of decay. Like Palestine is heading towards catastrophe, and we're watching it. Do you get a sense that we can contribute a lot in terms of like showing the stories and being there and bearing witness to the situation, but at the same time, do you get questions from the readers? Yeah, but what do I do? I feel kind of hopeless. This is happening there, and there's nothing we can do.
Well, unfortunately, I feel some of that myself. I mean, what we can do is things like this, right? You've spent time there, you know the place. I've spent time there, I know the place. We talk about it. Maybe more people will learn. I understand this feeling of helplessness when you're watching what's going on. Obviously, nothing compared to what Palestinians must be feeling. But I think, people are on the street. They are on the street. They're putting pressure even in those places, let's say in Western Europe, where it's becoming almost or all but illegal to have pro-Palestinian demonstrations. And there's a crackdown now on saying certain phrases, thinking certain things, flying a Palestinian flag. All this is considered incitement to violence and is being considered illegal. But people are pushing back. So if I have any hope at all, it's that despite, it shows sort of how scared these governments are running, really. Because people are still pushing back and are trying to educate themselves, I think. Now, does that help the immediate situation? I don't know. I mean, people can put pressure on their governments, but when you hear someone like Biden talking the way he's talking, he seems to have, no genuine sympathy for what's going on in Gaza. He seems absolutely heartless. He seems cold-hearted. And he seems to be backing Israel up to the hilt. Now, what you really want is someone to say, we cannot have another Nakba. We cannot push these people into Egypt. I think there's enough stuff going on in the street. And sometimes it's not so much the West that matters anymore. It's really what's going on in the streets of the Arab world that are forcing those governments to reappraise a relationship with Israel. I don't think this is good for Israel, but the pressure can work in some circumstances. And, my feeling is it's not really a question of us to sort of evaluate whether we can be effective or not. Because in some ways we don't know that. And if you think about it too much, as I do sometimes, you sort of do get into this level of despair. You just have to do what's right. You have to say what you have to say. You have to do these sorts of interviews. And then if it does some good, it does some good. But you don't know if it is going to do some good. You just do what's good, hoping it'll go somewhere good.
Yeah, that's a really good message, because I've been feeling like that nowadays too. I've been trying to keep track of what's happening with authors, Palestinian authors and non-Palestinian authors doing work on Palestine, and some level of censorship around it. So we just had an incident in the Frankfurt book fair. So we have awards that are being withdrawn, presences like lectures and physical presence being canceled, things like that. And you mentioned once that you think that this comic book in particular, Palestine, was really made it out there because the New York Times reviewed it, so other people picked it up, and it does have a presence in that sense. And then you got an American Book Award. Do you think that if this had come out now, do you sense there will be a different pushback in terms of, you've been called, like we've all been called things for doing work on Palestine, but I think it would be harder in terms of criminalization and being excluded directly from places?
Well, I mean, just to be clear, that book has never been reviewed by the New York Times. Actually, I was very lucky in a way, because when I was doing these comics, these 9 comics that became the book Palestine, comics were not considered a serious medium, really.
Oh, yes.
And my sales were really low. I was so under the radar that it actually served the book well, because I could do it without people yelling in my ear, telling me I'm an anti-Semite, or that I'm this or I'm that, or making me question myself. I did it without anyone sort of interfering. Now that would probably be impossible. You know, I developed my own voice because no one else was yelling at me. Now, if I had to do that book, I hope I would have the fortitude to do it in the same way and to be strong about it. But who knows, you know? I mean, sometimes when you're a younger person, you can be very impressionable and maybe not 100% sure of yourself. As you get older, things roll off your back a bit easier. But I understand why younger artists, with people attacking them, especially when they're on social media, that can be very difficult. I mean, if you wade into this issue now, you're going to get flack.
Yes, and so just to clarify, was it, maybe I got information wrong, was it Footnotes from Gaza? There was one book of yours that
Footnotes in Gaza was reviewed by the New York Times.
Okay, so my bad. Everyone who's watching.
I'm the journalist who wants to get the facts just right.
No, perfect. Yeah, so like taking advantage of flying under the radar was very important, but now it seems that the job is actually not to fly under the radar at all, right? So try to get the word out as much as possible, since things are deteriorating. I wanted to bring another point that we're closing. We're getting to a close here. You did work like connecting poverty and social inequality, territorial conflict, settler colonialism, in a sense, in North America as well. Can you speak a little in terms of like the parallels that you can find? Because sometimes there's a sense, and this is something that's criticized by a lot of authors coming from the MENA region, decolonial authors, that usually in the West you tend to see that there's this exceptionalism about conflict and war and despair. Out there in those other countries, they're underdeveloped or understood as part of the global South or the third world. But there are a lot of things very close to home that sometimes are just not receiving the same level of attention, or just simply normalized, such as the history of colonialism that you have in the US and Canada. Canada, for example, with the situation with the residential schools, is still not properly approached, even though there are, methods and processes for truth and reconciliation, but it's still an open wound. So can you speak a little bit about these parallels of being these very different places, but also trying to identify these problems? in society that's considered to be more powerful, more hegemonic, and materially wealthier, right?
Well, it's kind of funny. I mean, I did the book about indigenous people in North America, in Canada, the Dene people. I did that sort of to get away from reporting on violence, to do something about resource extraction. But it turns out that a lot of violence was visited on indigenous people. You mentioned the residential schools where young people we're talking about 5-year-olds, 6-year-old people, kids, were taken from their parents and flown out of their communities to hundreds of kilometers away to be raised in these residential schools where they could be sort of basically made into white people, to get the values of white people, to have in their words, the Indian rubbed out of them, you know, and they were assimilated, they were Christianized, and they were given numbers, and they lost their connection to the land. And if I would say, and now there's a movement to regain that connection to the land. And if I'd say that the great similarity that I noticed between what was going on in North America among indigenous people and what goes on in Palestine is that really it centers around land. And the settler colonial project in Israel, Palestine is about acquiring land. It's about one people trying to live on the land and displacing others. So that's what you have, the settlements in the West Bank, and you have Israeli politicians talking about, you know, greater Israel, and that the entire region, the whole area of Judea, Samaria, as they call it, belongs to us. They want to settle the land. They want to bring Jews from abroad and settle it. In Canada, it's also about land, but it's not so much about settling that land as it is about taking the resources from that land. But what's interesting is, so, you know, they will want to employ perhaps indigenous people to help them take the resources out of that land, but they don't want the indigenous people to control that land because there's a lot of gold, there's a lot of oil, there's a lot of natural gas. There are diamonds there. So it's land, both conflicts or both areas, it's about land and people's connection to it. And both people have very strong connections to their land. Indigenous people, they know what's happened to them, and they're really trying to reconnect with their old ways of living, with that all were land-based, hunting, fishing, trapping, that sort of thing. And with Palestinians, it's very clear in their minds that if they go into Egypt, if they escape the bombs, as you said, they'll be ethnically cleansed to escape genocide. So I think a lot of them, I can't blame anyone for wanting to run from the area, but a lot of them understand that, and they do not want to be displaced again. And the other connection I found is a lot of indigenous people, when they were beginning to develop a real sense of a consciousness about their predicament, they were looking at other places on the planet where there were resistance movements, you know, whether it was in South Africa or whatever, but Palestinians were brought up to me. And there's one particular indigenous person, when I mentioned that I did a book about Palestine, he said, okay, I will talk to you then. Because he saw the connection himself. And the Palestinian resistance in the 70s had inspired him on some level, that people were fighting for their land.
So as my last question, just picking up on what you just said there, you know, I wasn't going to talk to you, but you mentioned Palestine, so now I can trust you because you were there. That kind of, I've gotten that a lot too. And in the sense, can we say that Palestinian solidarity, like properly understanding the plight of Palestinians, doing that in a way that's truthful to the story. So you just mentioned, you know, someone who wasn't going to talk to you and they decided to talk to you because of Palestine. It's also like a way of connecting, saying that, well, maybe I can trust you now. And I've gotten that a lot before too. In a sense, would you say that having an honest approach to Palestine, that's more solidaristic, that's fighting this hegemonic agenda of treating them either as capital V victims, like you said, or capital V villains, as is the case with mainstream media, having that approach is a way of connecting to people internationally, but it's also, in a sense, a little bit of a litmus test of humanity and how you can empathize with the plights of others?
Well, I think what it helps you do, if you are honest in your approach, I think you can reach people better who don't know much about the issue. If you're willing to talk about the contradictions and sort of the complications and the nuance, even the other side, to understand the other side of the issue, all that helps to educate people, I think. And I think, you know, my own goal is to reach people. It's not to create a polemic that only reaches those people who already agree with me. I'm not really one for polemics unless I want to sort of fortify a position I already have. I'm interested in approaching the reader as someone who's intelligent and wants to know, but sort of doesn't want any bullshit either.
I think that's a really good way of closing the conversation today here, because this is definitely a book that's cutting through the bullshit, the 9 issues that came together as a book. I really, really do recommend, like I read it many years ago directly in English, and like having this edition by Veneta, like very beautiful cover, and you know, it's a really good size for actually getting a sense of the writing and the images and getting some of the background stories as well. So I want to thank Joe for taking the time for being with us here today. This is an interview obviously in English, but coming out also with the subtitles in Portuguese. And I highly recommend that people go and grab this to get a sense of like of Palestine with the good and the bad. And I think that's really helpful for us to cut through these reductionist positions that are really not helping us fight for freedom in the region or fight in a solidaristic manner. Thank you so much.
Sabrina, thank you. It was a great conversation.